All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we're going to speak, dear brothers and sisters and esteemed colleagues, about marital bliss and insights from an Islamic psychological viewpoint. And you guys already know who I was already introduced, but I'm your brother Seyed Jamaluddin Miri. So essentially, let's start by reflecting upon the anthropological definition of marriage. This is not the Islamic definition, by the way, dear brothers and sisters. So, according to the most of the anthropologists, and anthropology is studies and the science of cultures and human beings and human civilizations, right? So, according to the most anthropologists, marriage is considered to be a cultural universal. So in most cultures, historically and in the contemporary era as well, marriage served the purpose of procreation rights, childbearing rights, and the responsibility of a couple to raise the child. Above all, marriage makes sure the child reaches a mature procreation age and is protected. So marriage is the formation of a socially recognized union. And with other words, from an anthropological point of view, marriage could also be defined by three basic characteristics. One, sexual relationships that are sanctioned by society. Two, a division of labor in the household with shared economic resources. And three, the social legitimacy and legal rights of children from the union. So my beloved brothers and sisters, and their esteemed colleagues, this is an anthropological definition of marriage. Now, what is modernity's approach towards marriage? And with modernity, we mean this contemporary era, right? An era that is unfortunately very secularized, right? So marriage has become a project rather than a process. So people tend to marry quite late due to these notions. For instance, at least here in the West where I live in Sweden, but I'm sure for a lot of you as participants, dear beloved brothers and sisters, or my colleagues here, brother and sisters, I'm sure in many cultures and many countries today, everybody is raised with the notion that you need to first study and you need to do your master's and you need to do your bachelor's and you need to have a work. And of course, the work for men is crucial, but nevertheless, it's almost like you need to do a career before you get married. So it becomes a project rather than a process, which was not an Islamic approach historically, by the way. Marriage has also become a civil matter rather than a sacred matter. So today people are getting married, at least in the Western realm, in a civil way, not adding the sacred aspect of it. Marriage has become something that is only based upon the horizontal level of our life, which is for the sake of the worldly matters, the dunyawi matters, status, etc., rather than the ukhravi level, which is the vertical level, which is the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which makes it a sacred thing. Marriage does not necessitate the monopoly of sexual activity within the framework of husband and wife relationship, because we know that in secularized societies, unfortunately, there is a lot of fitna and a lot of zina, because intimacy has become a public and economical matter with the sexualization of the public spaces, rather than a private and sacred manner, which is the Islamic approach to it. Marriage does not necessitate the objective of procreation anymore, because people are having children, at least in the secularized part of the world, without being married. And marriage has become a nafsani thing, an egocentric thing, rather than something that is heart-oriented or qalbani. So people say, I want to get married because I want it, not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees that as something important. And that's half of our religion, is what the Prophet ﷺ said that the marriage is. Now, what is the Islamic view towards marriage, dear excellent brothers and sisters? So we know this hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever Allah provides with a righteous wife, Allah has assisted him in half of his religion. Let him fear Allah regarding the second half. So what we understand from this hadith is that half of our religion, dear excellent brothers and sisters, is the marriage. That's a huge amount of our religion, isn't it? So how can we view marriage from an Islamic psychological lens? So I told you guys that from the modern point of view, from the secular point of view, marriage is a project. But we see marriage as a process rather than a project. We grow with each other through marriage as husband and wife, as spouses, right? Marriage is also something sacred. It's not only a civil matter, because as we saw in the hadith that I just shared, it constitutes half of our deen. And marriage has both the horizontal level, which is the dunyavi level, because marriage gives security, provides safety, and at the same time, it has a vertical level, which is the ukhrawi level, which is a vessel towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The marriage brings you, if it's constituted or if it's conducted in the right way, according to Quran and Sunnah, it brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you need to negotiate, you need to compromise, you need to break your nafs. You're now partnering with a person which will be your closest partner when it comes to your spiritual rectification, your way of conducting things in life. Marriage does necessitate the monopoly of sexual activity within the framework of husband and wife relationship. So as Muslims and from an Islamic psychological point of view, intimacy is private and a sacred matter that could only be conducted in the constitution of marriage. Marriage does necessitate the objective of procreation. So our offspring comes through the constitution of marriage, right? And marriage is also ruhani, spiritual, and qalbani, heartly initiative. Not because I want it only, because also it balances your nafs, right? Yourself, your jism, your body, and your aql, your mind, to be aligned with your qalb, which is your heart, which is the center of health, allowing you to access your ruh, your spirit, which ultimately is your wasila and connector with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Marriage is also something complementary rather than competitively. So we always say, as I work with marriage counseling, for instance, dear brothers and sisters, as a licensed counselor, and I often tell my clients that as husband and wife, you don't compete with one another, you complete one another, right? We have sacred roles. Some of the roles are different between the husband and the wife, and some of the roles are quite similar. They're sacred. We complement each other. We don't compete. The modern ideologies, the secular ideologies, these liberal ideologies, like, for instance, feminism or, socialism or, we'll take these two as examples, or liberalism. They want to compete. For instance, women should take men's role, the men should take women's role. As Muslim, we don't compete with one another. We complete each other. There are certain divine roles that Allah has given to each, gender and each, spouse as husband and wife. And there's certain roles that are common and where you can help each other and you can always negotiate as well. So these are sacred roles that makes that complementary and not that we compete. There are rights and obligation towards oneself and towards each other. So as a wife, you have rights and you have obligation, and as a husband, you have rights and obligation. Marriage is one of the greatest jihad al-nafs. What does that mean, dear brothers and sisters? What does it mean to break your nafs? To purify your nafs? Is to seek compromises and not my way or highway, in many ways. To listen to each other. And this is something I'm going to go back to later in this presentation. Marriage is also part of engaging in tahdib al-akhlaq, which is to refine one's character, which is the ultimate goal of bringing both partners to a state of mizan and balance and equilibrium, right? When we refine our character, when we try to break our nafs when we communicate with our spouse, it's not my way or highway. I'm trying to listen and learn as well. I'm trying to meet in the middle. This brings balance, which is health. Balance and health is something that is tied to one another. Marriage is also a way of reconnecting with your fitra, which is your natural pure disposition towards tawheed, as it allows you in a natural way, according to Sharia and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to engage in things that are natural, like love, like touch, like intimacy, right? So in the constitution of marriage, you're able to reconnect with the natural urges that you have according to Quran, Sunnah, and Sharia in a healthy way, which is through marriage between husband and wife. Marriage is not only a means of preserving the nuclear family, it is important indeed for that as well, a couple and their dependent children, but it's also a societal matter. And there is a proverb, this is an African proverb, dear brothers and sisters, it takes a village to raise a child. So marriage is something that the offspring, we have a societal role to raise this child as a village, even though the mother and father are their primary caregivers. Now, let's reflect upon the objectives of Sharia, maqasid al-Sharia, in relationship to marriage. The objectives of Sharia are 5 major objectives. There are 5 major objectives of Sharia, which is to preserve our health and well-being and to preserve things that are important in our society, and it's the objectives of Sharia. So one of these objectives are deen, to preserve our deen, which is spiritual health. Another thing is to preserve the nafs, the self, the ego, which is related to mental and physical health. One other aspect of Sharia, objective of Sharia, is to preserve your aql, your intellect, your mind, which is also related to mental and physical health. And then it's nasab, which is to preserve your lineage, children, which is social health. And finally, one of the main objectives are mal and wealth, which is also social health. So these 5 main goals, dear brothers and sisters, constitute Islam's great and comprehensive logic, which is a holistic approach. And these 5 objectives are all central in the constitution of marriage, hence allowing healthy marriages to be seen as both a private and a societal matter, ultimately becoming a sacred matter. So through religion, if it's done for the sake of Allah and has a spiritual connotation to it, then you're preserving your deen. Because spouses brings us, if spouses have this connection, they will come closer to Allah. It preserves your nafs, your ego, because you can allow your nafs to be purified through the constitution of marriage. So that's actually a way to preserve your spiritual health and your mental, physical health. It preserves your intellect, because now you have a spouse that you can have intellectual discussions and discourses with. And of course, procreation can only be established through the constitution of marriage. And last but not least, the wealth. A society where we have healthy marriages, we can also bring in wealth in ways where we can raise children to become active citizens, which will benefit the wealth of the society as well. Now, this is the model of Islamic psychology according to one of my teachers, Dr. Rothman. And I don't have time right now to go through marriage and its connection to this Islamic psychological model. But ultimately, just very briefly, because I have quite short time to do my presentation, my sincere apologies, dear brothers and sisters and excellent organizers. Nevertheless, if you see here, our nafs has 3 states, like 3 stages. It's tripartite. So you have nafs al-amara bil-su, the nafs, the ego that is, inclined to, to evil and to the waswas of shaitan. You have nafs al-lawama, which is the reproachable self, which is the part of the nafs that gives tarbiyah to the nafs so that it elevates itself. And finally, when you are purified, then you can reach the state of nafs al-mutmainah, the serene self, which is that you're in connection with Allah fully, and you accept the will of Allah, and you're also in connection with your fitra as well, right? So if you, for instance, utilize your marriage as a way to see it as a jihad al-nafs and purifying yourself, then you can actually, through the constitution of marriage, which is half of our deen, bring yourself to nafs al-mutmainah. And then you need to work with your nafs. You need to purify it. You need to purify your heart. You need to refine your character through the constitution of marriage, because your spouse is the closest person that you will ever have in human shape. I mean, the closest relationship that you will ever have is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with your creator, with your Lord, right? But besides Allah, your spouse will be the closest, because your friends will not see all of your private matters. They don't know all of your private matters. You're not connected with them physically the way that you are with your spouse, or socially, or psychologically, or spiritually. The same with your family members. Your spouse is the only one where you can have this holistic connection, where you connect with them both physically, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, in a way that you cannot do with others, right? And that's why if you go through the marriage as a way to refine your character, you can benefit from it from an Islamic psychological point of view, and see it as refinement of character and as a jihad al-nafs. Now, what does the sunnah, the seerah, and the shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ say about marriage as a constitution? So let's reflect upon some of the wives and the relationships that the Prophet ﷺ had with his wives. So for instance, with Khadija radiallahu anha, when the Prophet ﷺ received the first revelation, I'm sure you all know, he shook as he descended from Cave Hira, right? So his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, who was in her 50s, right, wrapped him in a blanket, assuring him that whatever he saw was not a curse, and that he was a man that was known to be trustworthy, right, al-amin, who was always kind to his family and friends, and never spoke an untrue word. So what Sayyidina Khadija gave here is a secure base. And she had emotional attunement, and she gave validation, both physically and emotionally. And this is really something that we can think about within the constitution of marriage, is that we need to give each other this emotional connection, this emotional and physical validation, and to see the marriage and see the spouse, whether it's the wife or the husband, as a secure base where you can be open about your emotions and your challenges and your struggles, and that we validate and support one another. How was the Prophet ﷺ's relationship with Aisha radiallahu anha? So we know that Aisha was very playful, and she was quite young, and the Prophet ﷺ would raise her when they were in the outdoors. She also became one of the greatest Islamic scholars of all time. So here we can see that that relationship is a reflection where there was a balance between depth and knowledge, discourse, because a lot of the hadith that we is tried to study and implement in our lives comes from the narrations of and the dissemination of Aisha radiallahu anha, because she was so smart and she really learned so much from the Prophet ﷺ. She always asked very relevant questions, often, right? And there was also depth, but also lightheartedness, because they had fun with one another, right? So here you can see that this relationship can give us a lot of inspiration about curiosity and intellectual growth. Now, the conclusion, dear brothers and sisters, which is the final part of my presentation, and please forgive me for being so quick in my presentation. I know that I only have 25 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. The sacred nature of marriage, we need to always reflect upon when it comes to understanding how we can regain marital bliss, right? So marriage is not for the sake of the nafs, but for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ said that marriage is half of our deen, highlighting its importance, dear brothers and sisters. Marriage should be rooted in sacredness, spirituality, and tawheed. And one of the objectives of Sharia, which I referred to earlier in my presentation, includes safeguarding lineage and family, and that is through marriage. The only way that we can achieve this objective of Sharia is through marriage, right? Marriage is also a path to growth and purification. So marriage is a means for, as I mentioned, tazkiyat al-nafs, purification of the self, riyadat al-nafs, disciplining the self, mujahadat al-nafs, struggling against the self, and siyasat al-nafs, which is diplomacy with the self. The spouse is a mirror of the nafs, revealing both strength and weaknesses. And in moments of conflict, one can ask, dear brothers and sisters, when you're in conflict with your spouse, if you're married. If you're not, then you can think about this already. Is my response from my nafs when I'm arguing with my spouse? And if so, which part of it? Which aspect of it? Is it nafs al-amara? Is it nafs al-lawama? Is it from nafs al-mutmainah? Am I prioritizing being right, quote to quote, over learning and improving? These are fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves as a way to see marriage as something that could purify ourselves and as part of our personal development. And trials in marriage, bala and ibtidal, are means of spiritual refinement, bringing spouses closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, as a conclusion, let's reflect upon gratitude and positivity and emotional memory, dear excellent brothers and sisters. One of the great scholars of our Islamic psychology tradition is 𝗏 𝗪𝗏. He was a Sunni Persian scholar from Afghanistan, and I recommend you guys to read his book that Professor Malik Badri, the father of Islamic psychology, has translated from Arabic to English, which is called The Sustainers of the Soul. And in that book, 𝗏 𝗪𝗏 says the following, that you should store positive experiences in your memory when you're going through positivity in life. Because when you go through struggles in life and negativity, then you can recall these positive experiences from your memory as reminders that things can improve. So, in the marriage, even when we go through struggles, try to always internalize and remember the positive times that you had with your spouse. And don't let the negativity blur your reception and your connection with the positivity that you have experienced as well. Also here, it's worth to speak about, and it's worth mentioning, dear brothers and sisters, about husn al-dhan, positive opinion, and that it has 3 levels, and that this is something you can utilize in your relationship with your spouse. So the first level, or these are not first or second or third level, they're all, I'm just speaking about the 1, 2, 3, but the first level is husn al-dhan billah, but I'm starting with the husn al-dhan bil nafs. So husn al-dhan bil nafs is to have positive opinion of your own good qualities while acknowledging flaws, that you're good enough spouse. You're not perfect. I'm sure everybody has shortcomings. Allah knows that I have a lot of shortcomings. But by actually having husn done towards yourself, dear brothers and sisters, then you can see that you're a human being with shortcomings and flaws, and that you have good qualities and less good qualities, and you're acknowledging them both. And that makes you more stable, more humble, but also that you still believe in yourself, and you can believe that you can improve. You don't need to hate yourself in order to be humble. You can believe in yourself, but you don't need to believe that you're perfect, because perfection doesn't exist in this realm. And we are following the sunnah as a way to perfect ourselves. The other aspect is husn dan bil nas. This is to assume the best about one's spouse and others. So it's to have positive opinion about others. So always try your best to have positive opinion about your spouse. Have husn dan bil nas. And finally, and the most ultimately, and the most important is husn dan billah. So always have positive opinion towards Allah Azza wa Jal, trusting that all trials and joys and sa'ada comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for one's growth. And then you can always utilize tawbah and forgiveness and istighfar as key components to have a sustained healthy marriages. You know, if your spouse wants to do tawbah because he or she has made a mistake, then accept it. And Ali radiallahu anhu, he spoke about the 6 steps of tawbah. One step of tawbah is to recognize your shortcomings, to not do it again for the sake of Allah, to improve yourself in front of Allah, to ask for forgiveness for the one that you have made mistakes towards, and to see this as a path towards purification and personal growth. So tawbah is essential. And as a spouse who has been that has faced wrongdoing, then we can try our best to forgive and allow the person to grow and not to define them by the mistakes. And for the person who made mistake, the spouse who made mistake, rest assured that you can learn from it if you're just open to it, and try your best to not do it again. Also, marriage as a means of strengthening the ummah. So raising pious children, dear excellent brothers and sisters and colleagues, is a form of sadaqah jariyah, right? A lot of us, we always say that we have all heard from our parents or from our teachers that pious children, right, is a sadaqah jariyah, something that we leave with, right? So righteous parents, they are one of the obligations is to raise righteous children and righteous citizens that could contribute to a strong Muslim society. And within the multiplexity of the sunnah, this allows for flexibility, dynamicism, and negotiation within Islamic guidelines. So there are certain things that are black and white when it comes to the sunnah, and there are certain things where you can approach it differently, right? And depending on this, it allows us for flexibility, dynamicism, and negotiation between, for instance, the sacred role of the wife and the sacred role of the husband when it comes to giving tarbiyah to the children, as an example of many examples within the constitution of marriage. Communication and conflict resolution in marriage. There is a lot of tools that we can use from our tradition, dear beloved brothers and sisters, to bring about effective communication. Effective communication. For instance, shura. You can always try to have shura with your spouse, which is to consult and have mutual decision-making procedures. You can have sulh, which is reconciliation and compromise, to bring peace by reconciling, by understanding. And then when you reconcile, it's good to have active listening and sama, to active listen, to try to understand, not just to respond. Sometimes when we're listening to our counterparts, whether it's our spouse, if you're married, whether it's your friend or companions, whoever, we tend to want to rebuttal and give an answer and give a response rather than actively listening. So to have sama is to active listen, to truly understand. It doesn't mean that you need to agree, but at least understand. And then finally, to build that heart-to-heart connection, that murabata, that connection between hearts, between heart of the husband and heart of the wife and vice versa. This will allow for an alliance and a rapport that will be so strong that even when you guys go through miscommunication and misunderstanding, if the murabata is there, then it's always ways where you can do sama, suhul, and implement shura, inshallah. Also to avoid harmful speech. If we want bliss in our marriage, harmful speech won't help. I always recommend my clients when I do marriage counseling to try to not use loaded words. Now, loaded words can be subjective, dear brothers and sisters. Something that might be loaded for you might not be loaded for your spouse. So you need to come into agreement of what is loaded and what is not loaded, right? But there is an example from Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, where we have been told that he used to have stones in his mouth as a way to prevent saying things that he would regret later. Subhanallah. Isn't this amazing, dear brothers and sisters? That's why the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, these are our role models. So imagine Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu walking with stones. Now, I'm not saying that we should do that literally, but it's a metaphor for us to understand that we need to be careful of what we say. We don't want to harm our spouse or, disrespect our spouse or hurt our spouse intentionally. So to have that metaphor of stones in the mouth is a way to be, very intentional in the way you communicate, and try your best to not evoke feelings that could be distressful in its nature. Understanding individual differences in marriage is also very important. Each spouse should recognize their own character strengths and weaknesses. That's why it's important to do tafakkur and contemplation about yourself and introspection about yourself to understand what is my shortcomings, what is my flaws, and what is my strength. Also to understand each other's communication style. Which communication style do I have? Am I passive aggressive? Am I passive? Am I aggressive? Am I assertive? There is these theories of communication within modern psychology, which is quite congruent with Quran and Sunnah, or aligned at least, or with the Islamic, epistemological understanding of reality of things that you can utilize. For instance, these 4 communication styles are quite valuable as a way to understand yourself and your spouse. Also, your temperament, your energy, your mizaj. Some people are more introverted. Some people are more extroverted. And a marriage could be a place where you can find balance. I often say that sometimes I think in marriage it's important that we share the same values as spouses, right? Same spiritual values, even cultural values, even social values could be very good. But when it comes to temperament, or when it comes to your mizaj, or when it comes to your maybe energy or your character trait, it could be an avenue where we can balance each other. So imagine if we are 2 extroverted people being with each other, that might create a lot of friction. So maybe it's good for one extrovert to be with an introvert and vice versa, as a way to balance each other so we become ambiverts. Marriage is about balance, mizan wasatiyah. As I mentioned, not competition, but completion. Even Western psychological concepts like servant leadership model recognizes the Islamic principle of the Amir as a servant. And you should actually study the servant leadership model, which you can find in social psychological manuscripts and in industrial and organizational manuscripts. It's a very interesting model, and it's actually very congruent with the Islamic principles. As I mentioned before, I'm done in 1 minute, brothers and sisters. Please forgive me. The prophetic examples of marriage. We saw how Khadija radiallahu anhu supported the Prophet ﷺ emotionally and supported the mission of Islam financially. Aisha radiallahu anha had a playful and intellectual companionship with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Salama radiallahu anha offered strategic counsel during Hudaybiyah, in the context of Hudaybiyah. So here you can see the role of the spouse, the role of the wife, and of course the Prophet ﷺ as the best example for the role of the husband as well. Marriage is also a spiritual pathway where we can gain sakina, mawadda, and rahmah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Rum, verse 21, and among His sign is that He created for you from yourself spouses that you may find tranquility and sakina in them, and He placed between you love, mawadda, and mercy, rahmah. So the state of sakina is a spiritual experience, dear brothers and sisters, when hearts align in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is aspect of marriage that we need to bring there, the sakina. And mawadda in marriage can lead to a deeper connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as marriage is a form of ibadah, if you see it like that. And mawadda in marriage is not just passion and desire and shahawat, but a way to attain higher spiritual state. And with regard to rahmah, the Prophet ﷺ said, when a husband and wife look at each other with love, Allah looks at them with mercy and rahmah, subhanAllah. So always have that connection with your spouse. Have love in your eyes. Connect with him and her and be proud of this relationship, which is sacred that you have. The role of Amir and Amira in marriage. So the Amir, the husband, serves and leads with sacrifice, responsibility, and humility. This is servitude leadership. We always say the Amir is not authoritarian, which is the Firawi way, where you just force people to do the way you want them to do. Rather, it is the prophetic way. It is to serve, it is to encourage and to lead, both being firm and compassionate. That is the servitude leadership, right? That is not the Firawi way. That is authority. Authority is great. We give authority to different people based upon their roles, based upon their knowledge. But authoritarian is Firawi. And Amira, which is the wife, can give encouragement, emotional support, and be part of the partnership and companionship, which we saw with the example of Khadija radiallahu anhu as the biggest supporter for the Prophet ﷺ during all of his trials. This is the sacred essence of marriage. That marriage is an amana from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, dear brothers and sisters. And the ultimate goal is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure and not just personal comfort or dunyavi benefits. And that the trials and bala in marriage are a means of purification and an opportunity to realign one's intentions and niyyah. And spouses should always reflect together, is our marriage bringing me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If not, what changes needs to be done for us to bring it to that point of it being a vessel that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And that the sunnah provides the ultimate blueprint for a sacred and fulfilling marriage. And this is my final slide, and this is just to reflect upon the problems of modernity. We have a lot of fornication in modernity in this contemporary era, dear brothers and sisters and esteemed colleagues. That's why Solace is doing such an amazing work in speaking about these issues in this conference and how we can have stable relationships, whether it's through marriage or other relationships in life. Fornication is a problem. More people are unmarried due to different socializing theories and due to different social issues in the societies that are not allowing people to get married. There's a lot of stigmatization of women and men that have been divorced. This was not the case during the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. During the Prophet's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, people used to marry after they got divorced or when their spouse passed away. Salama radiallahu anha is an example. When her beloved husband passed away, then she remarried with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So stigmatization is nothing from our tradition. As Muslim, this is a cultural phenomenon. Marriage has become a culture nafsani phenomena sometimes, rather than something that is according to Quran and Sunnah. So for instance, you need to have such a huge, wedding as a way to show the status of your family, and a lot of people do not have money to pay for these weddings, and then they cannot get married, which is a problem. But it doesn't need to be like this. Of course, if you want to have a big wedding, by all means, if you can afford it, then have it. That's beautiful. But it doesn't need to be like that. We need to make it easier. There is also this projectification of marriage. It becomes a project rather than a process. So you need to first be done with this studies and this work and this studies and this education before I get married. This is a very Western secular way. This is not the Islamic way. You can get married and you can still do your career. You can get married and you can still gain your education. That's perfectly fine. So the secular liberal views of marriage becomes the norm, even within the Muslim psyche indirectly. And I really believe that pre-marriage counseling could be something that could help us to contemplate about what is it to be a sacred couple in this sacred relationship of marriage. A lot of women and men, they're also being disregarded because of their race and age and status, which is not something that is according to Quran and Sunnah. So my beloved brothers and sisters, thank you so much for listening. Jazakallah khairan. Please forgive me for any shortcomings. If I said anything wrong or mentioned anything wrong, rest assured that all the mistakes are solidly mine. And if anything good came from my presentation, it's all from Allah. The mistakes are mine. This lecture is usually a 2-hour lecture that I try to do in a very short time. There's a lot of other slides I wanted to do. So maybe next conference, inshallah. I want to thank Solace and IOU for organizing this. And thank you so much, Ustad Abdullah Khan, Brother Safwan, and rest of the team for the amazing work you guys are doing. And I'm looking forward to work with you all and collaborate. And thank you all, dear participants and dear brothers and sisters, for joining. To be amongst esteemed scholars like all those who are speaking in this blessed conference today is truly an honor. And I want to thank all of the scholars and also Dr. Bilal Phillips as one of the leading scholars in building Islamic institutions and curriculum for the amazing work that you all are doing. So Jazakallah khair, also to Dr. Khalili and other scholars who have presented today as well. This is just some links to my contact details. If you want to reach out, if you have any questions, you want to have access to my presentation, feel free to email me or write to me on WhatsApp. And also our organization, ISIP, the International Students of Islamic Psychology. We have some WhatsApp groups for discussions and research sharing related to those who are interested in the field of Islamic psychology. This is a QR code to one of our WhatsApp groups. Jazakallah khairan once more, and I wish you all a great continuation of the day. It was an honor to be with y'all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.